Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some choices feel like they're made for you, even before you make them? Well, this new study dives deep into how we react to the little nudges, or defaults, that are set for us when making decisions, and whether we think the people who set them have our best interests at heart. This research is a fascinating look at how policy decisions, like what option is already picked for you when signing up for something, can influence your choices. The original study by McKenzie and his colleagues way back in 2006 suggested that when a default option is chosen, people see it as a recommendation from the policymakers. So, if organ donation is the default, people might think the government wants them to be an organ donor, and they're more likely to go along with it. These researchers set out to see if those findings still hold up today and to explore them a bit further. Imagine you are presented with a form and one box is already checked. You might think, oh, this must be the way it is supposed to be done, right? That is the default effect. The core idea here is that defaults aren't just pre-selected options. They send a message. This new study by Teng and Lau and their colleagues wanted to replicate 3 key experiments from that 2006 paper, which looked at organ donations and retirement plans. They found that yes, indeed, people do make inferences about what policymakers think and want based on those default choices. But they also added a really interesting twist. What happens when there is no default at all? So, what exactly is this default effect? Think about it like this. The default is the option that is already chosen for you. If you have to actively change it, you probably won't. This is a handy tool for policymakers and businesses to guide people towards certain choices, like encouraging organ donation or saving for retirement. The original McKenzie study suggested that a big reason defaults work is that people see them as an implicit endorsement or recommendation from the experts, the policymakers themselves. It's like the government is subtly saying, this is the good choice, this is what we recommend. They decided to replicate 3 specific studies. In study 1, they looked at organ donations. They asked people if they were willing to be organ donors, if they thought others should be, and what they'd choose as a default policy. The original study found that people who were already willing to donate were more likely to choose donation as the default. This makes intuitive sense, right? If you are on board with something, you are more likely to set it as the default for others. Then came study 2, also about organ donations here. Participants were put into one of 2 groups. One group saw that the default policy was to be an organ donor unless you opted out. The other group saw that the default was not to be an organ donor unless you opted in. After seeing the default, participants were asked what they thought of the policymakers who made that decision. Did they think the policymakers were actually willing to be donors themselves? And did they think those policymakers believed others should be donors? The original findings were pretty strong when the default was donation. People thought the policymakers were much more likely to be donors and to believe in donation for others. Study 3 shifted to retirement plans. Similar to study 2, participants were shown different default retirement plan scenarios. One group saw that the default was to be automatically enrolled in a retirement plan, unless they actively chose not to be. Another group saw the default was not to be enrolled unless they actively chose to be. They then rated what they thought about the HR staff who made these decisions. Did they think HR staff were enrolled themselves? Did they think HR believed employees should enroll or even wanted to enroll? Again, the original study found that setting the default to enrollment made people think more favorably of HR's intentions and believe that enrollment was the norm. Now, a key part of this new research is that they conducted a direct replication. They wanted to make sure the original findings were robust. They recruited over 600 participants online, which is a much larger sample than the original studies used. This is important because with a larger sample, they can be more confident in their results and get a clearer picture of the actual effect size. They used careful statistical methods to determine how large a sample they needed to reliably detect effects. And they even used a small telescope approach to be sure they could find effects even if they were much weaker than originally reported. This all shows a commitment to rigorous science and open practices, with their data and code shared online. The researchers recruited 602 participants from the United States using Prolific, an online platform. This is a good step towards getting a more diverse sample than the original studies, which used university students. The average age of their participants was around 40, which is older and likely more representative of the general population than student samples. Instead of running the studies separately, like in the original paper, they combined all 3 studies into one large survey, presented in a random order. This is a clever design choice that helps them check for consistency and make sure their findings aren't just due to the specific order things were presented. For study 2 and 3, participants were randomly assigned to the different default conditions. Here is where the extension comes in. In study 3, they added a brand new condition, a no default control group. In this group, participants were told there was no default and they had to actively choose whether to enroll or not. The goal was to see if the not enroll default was perceived differently than having no default at all. Does setting a default to not do something still send a message? Or is it just a neutral baseline? And how does it compare to having no default whatsoever? So, what did they find? The results were very encouraging for the replication. All 3 studies from McKenzie et al. 2006 were successfully replicated. In study 1, the findings about organ donation preferences and chosen defaults held up, with similar or even larger effect sizes. This means that people who personally support organ donation are indeed more likely to set it as the default policy for others. In study 2, the replication was also strong. When policymakers set a default for automatic organ donation enrollment, participants still inferred that the policymakers were more willing to be donors themselves and believed others ought to donate. The effect sizes were comparable to the original study, showing that this perception of implicit endorsement by policymakers is quite consistent. And in study 3, the replication regarding retirement plans was also successful across multiple measures. Participants still believed that setting a default for enrollment would lead to higher enrollment rates overall and for themselves. They also continued to perceive HR staff as more likely to be enrolled and to believe that employees should and want to enroll in a retirement plan when that was the default. The effect sizes here were again comparable or even larger than in the original study, indicating a robust finding. Now, for the extension, the addition of the no default condition in study 3. This is where things get really interesting. When they compared the enroll default, the not enroll default, and the no default condition, they found something intriguing. The no default condition generally fell in between the enrolled and not enrolled default, but it was consistently closer to the not enrolled default. This suggests that setting a default to not enroll is not just neutral. It seems to send a weaker signal than the enrolled default. But it is not the same as having no default choice at all. The researchers explain this by talking about action versus inaction. Setting a default to enroll is seen as a deliberate action, a clear message from the policymakers. Setting a default to not enroll or having no default might be perceived more as an inaction or omission. And in our minds, actions often carry more weight and signal a clearer intent than inactions. So, when policymakers actively set the default to enroll, it sends a stronger signal of their endorsement and intent to guide people. What does all this mean for us? It confirms that defaults are powerful. They're not just conveniences, they're subtle messages that shape how we perceive the intentions of those in power. This has huge implications for public policy. If a government wants to encourage something like saving for retirement or organ donation, setting a positive default is a very effective strategy, not just because people might stick with it, but because it makes them believe the policymakers themselves support it and want others to too. However, the researchers also point out some important limitations. The study was conducted with us participants and online, so generalizability to other cultures or different settings might vary. They also mentioned that trust in the policymaker plays a role. If you don't trust the people setting the default, the effect might be weaker. Future research could explore how things like transparency about nudges and trust in institutions impact these default effects. Do people prefer nudges be transparent or work in the dark to be most effective? That is a debate for another day, but this study clearly shows that the way choices are presented matters, and it can reflect and shape our perceptions of the decision makers. Overall, this study provides strong evidence that the original findings of McKenzie et al. 2006 still hold true today. Defaults matter and they carry meaning. They're not just convenient options, but signals of implicit endorsement that influence our judgments about those who set them. It's a powerful reminder of how much our environment can shape our decisions and our perceptions, often in ways we don't even realize. Thanks for joining me on RUBIN'S Mind Lab. If you found this breakdown helpful, give us a like, leave a comment with your thoughts on defaults and choice architecture. And don't forget to subscribe for more insights into the fascinating world of psychology. See you in the next one.